Hi, welcome to this edition of the New Ideal Live podcast. I'm Onkar Gate, and I'm going to be joined in a moment by my colleagues at the Ayn Rand Institute, Yaron Brook and Robert Mayhew. And our topic tonight is thinking about the US presidential elections. Now, just before bringing them on to join me, if you're a reminder that if you want to join us on Zoom, we're broadcasting on YouTube, on Facebook, but if you want to join on Zoom, the URL or the meeting ID is 812-506-718. That's 812-506-718. And it's up in here on the screen too. But now I'm going to stop my screen share and bring in Yaron and Robert. Hi, Robert.
Hello.
And we're still waiting for Yaron.
I'm here.
There we go. Great. Thanks for joining. So I'll set up a little bit of just why we're doing this, why we wanted to have this particular topic. We've got a lot of questions, comments, some critical comments about ARI's political commentary, political stand, in particular, as one can imagine, given how close we are to the election and what is going on. It surrounds the election and Trump and thinking about the Republicans and the Democrats. And wanted to talk about this head on, about how we think about this at the Institute. And in particular, some of the comments are, well, we're a 501c3 organization. We're not supposed to be involved in political. I mean, it would be put in different ways, but sometimes it's even put like political commentary, commenting on the election. It will be sometimes it'll be put in various ways. And usually, though not always, usually it's when someone doesn't quite agree with what we say, then it's, should you really be saying this because you're a 501c3? Sometimes it's, I really agree with what you guys are saying, but you're a 501c3, so should you be doing this? But that's not the norm. The norm is, it's usually like, I don't quite agree.
I've not heard that one.
Pardon?
I've not heard that version of the criticism.
I've got it once in a while, but it's not dominant. But so I want to talk head on, and at the start, we are a 501c3 organization. We don't get involved in campaigns, in trying to tell people who they should vote for. We don't support a particular candidate and say, vote for him, don't vote for his opponent, and so on. So we don't get involved in that. But we'll talk a little bit about that, because on the other hand, we still do political commentary, political analysis, which includes talking about elected officials and so on. So we don't steer clear of the whole issue, but we're not campaigning. And to talk about that distinction. So that's one of the issues I want to talk about. We don't have to spend that much time on it. The other is, so a second issue, and this is sort of the order that we're going to go in this evening of topics. So talk a little bit about ARI as a 501c3 organization and what that means. Two, to normalize a little bit the wider phenomenon that we get critical comments, questions about issues like this, and not only political issues, it includes philosophical issues, but it's not like all the fans of Ayn Rand or even fans of ARI, or however you would put it exactly, think that they agree with everything that we say or do, but here's the one issue that they don't. So I want to talk a little bit about, like, this is an ongoing issue that ARI has to navigate, and this has been since its inception in the 80s. But then the two biggest blocks of time on the issues that I want to spend is thinking, one, about how Ayn Rand thought about the US political trends, elections, voting. She wrote a lot, at least from Kennedy as president onwards, about US election, particularly presidential candidates and so on. So talk about how she thought about that, because some of the critical comments are, you're not getting Ayn Rand at all right about how she thought about the political trends in elections. So talk a little bit about how we interpret what her views and analysis was, and lessons we take from that. and then talk about today's political situation and political context and how we look at it. So those are the 4 topics that we're going to take. And again, to start with the 501c3 status, and I'm going to ask you, Yaron, since you've talked the most, I think, publicly about what this means and doesn't mean.
Yeah, so first, I mean, we take this very seriously at the Institute. I mean, it is important because our status as a not-for-profit depends on us not violating the law. And in this case, it is a legal issue. We have consulted often with attorneys over the years with regard to what constitutes a violation of 501c3 and what doesn't. So for all of you who wonder, we take it seriously, we think about it, and we talk to lawyers in addition. Basically, the idea here is that as long as we're not advocating for particular candidates, advocating and rallying people around specific votes of Congress, not even about a topic. Like, for example, we can be against Obamacare and we can comment on Obamacare and discuss Obamacare, but when the vote comes, it would be a violation of our 501c3 status to tell all of our contributors, write your congressman, we have to defeat AB 367 or whatever the title of the bill happens to be. We can do that. We can't explicitly come out as an organization for or against any specific candidate. And maybe relevant to this issue is to understand that we can do that as individuals, right? In a sense, private lives. We're not, the fact that we're employees, or in my case, chairman of the board of the Ayn Rand Institute, does not make it such that 24/7 we speak for the Ayn Rand Institute. That would be absurd. So, for example, I've talked about this often, and I think others have talked about my podcast is not the Ayn Rand Institute. It doesn't represent the Ayn Rand Institute. So I can say on my podcast things that I cannot say when I'm speaking for the Institute, like right now, because this is a Institute webinar. So we cannot advocate for specific candidates as ARI. We cannot argue for against particular bills or encourage people to participate in the political process in a pre-specified way. But we're not restricted in commenting on broad political issues, certainly even on broad political issues that are being voted on, for example, Obamacare. Cato, Heritage, AEI, the big Brookings, the big think tanks all do it. They actually probably are far more aggressive about these things than we are. It's not a big focus of us. And even with regard to particular legislation, particular candidates, there's even a provision in the budget, in the law, that says you can still do it a little bit. You just can't spend more than 5% of your budget or something like that. We try not to do it at all, so as to stay safe. But we can certainly talk about policy in a broad sense, its application, its consequences, and what we think the policy should be. Those are all completely within the realm of what a non-for-profit can do. And think about the think tanks that would be out of business if they couldn't do that.
And I just add to your list of the examples that you gave, because you might think of some of these, they're nonpartisan, or at least try to be. Turning Point USA is a 501c3, and I don't think anybody right now thinks of them as nonpartisan.
And Heritage isn't nonpartisan. It's clearly Republican and so on. And Brookings is clearly on the left. So while they call themselves that, but think about it. Cato actually, and all of these think tanks have actually been involved in writing legislation. That is, they work with congressmen, they work with senators on actual language in the legislation. They testify before Congress. They do things. So there's a wide array of what is allowable within the 501c3 designation.
Okay, Robert, anything you want to?
No, I don't have really anything to add to that.
Okay, so that's good. And I should say, we're going to try to leave at least, we're going to go for 2 hours likely. We'll try to leave at least half an hour for questions, though if there's any questions that are coming that are really directly on what we're talking about, we might take them earlier, but there'll be time for questions certainly, so you can ask more about that. Okay, so that's one about ARI as a 501c3 organization. Now, the second issue that I wanted to talk a little bit about, again, not spend that much time on it, but which is that we regularly get comments from our supporters, from fans of Ayn Rand, that are critical. Some it's constructive criticism, some it's not constructive criticism. And I want to, here's some issues on which we've got critical comment. And part of what I want to get clear or get on the table is that it really ranges a lot, the critical comments that we get. As I say, they're often intertwined with political issues, but not always. And I think there's a tendency for when we get critical comments to think, the sort of the fans, and to think everybody probably agrees with the criticism, but often we get criticisms that pull in different directions. So even on Trump, we get people who, you're too hard on Trump, you don't understand Trump, but we get people, and more than one, who's, you're not aggressive enough in criticizing Trump, and he's like, this guy's a total disaster, and you should have weekly commentary on this, and you only have a few things, and and that's almost on every issue. To take some of the other political issues, I mean, a long-standing one since ARI's existence is how ARI relates to libertarians, including the Libertarian Party. And again, there's criticism from, why are you talking to this person, dealing with this organization? Why were you at a Cato event? So that's you shouldn't deal with them at all. You should be completely hands-off. And the other criticism is, like, these are your natural allies. Why aren't you talking to them every week and doing all kinds of events with them? And I mean, you could multiply the examples, and we could talk about a few others. But the way I think about it is, look, for all these kinds of issues, we have to make judgments about it. And they're not easy judgments. They take a lot of reflection on the issues, what we think about the issues. And it's natural that there's going to be disagreements about them. So it's not, or it's really surprising that not everybody agrees 100%. And sometimes I think the disagreement is, yeah, I can understand why the person has a different view. And sometimes I think, no, they really don't understand either the particular organization that we're dealing with or not dealing with, or the principles involved in thinking about, should one deal with the organization or not, to take the kind of libertarian issue. And it's like, this is inherent to intellectual issues, but if you guys want to weigh in, partly how you think about this.
Yeah, I think one important distinction to make is who are you disagreeing with, because that's going to be an important part. For example, I've heard criticisms, I don't like the stand you take on abortion. Well, that's not a disagreement with our interpretation or application of Ayn Rand. It's, you disagree with Ayn Rand on that point, and then you can't expect ARI, which is doing its best to understand and teach and have commentary that's up to date, but is applying her principles, to abandon that. It's not going to happen. So a lot of the issues I think are really, some of them are quite difficult. Libertarianism has evolved in certain ways. Should we deal with this organization or that? What about the party? But dealing with David Kelly's, or to me, that's a no-brainer. I mean, there's going to be, not all disagreements are going to be the same, but I think that one of the first things to, and this is going to apply to evaluating elections too, is who exactly are you disagreeing? And if you're disagreeing with Ayn Rand, that has to be articulated in your disagreement, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's this idea that it's hard is important. That is, and I gave a talk years ago on applying objectivism is hard. Philosophy doesn't give you as a direct deduction what you should think about this or that candidate, or what you should think about this or that event, or how to respond to 9/11, or what to do about Salman Rushdie, or any of these things. It doesn't give you, it's not like a computer. You plop a few of the facts in and bam, the right answer comes out. To apply abstract ideas to particular concretes is difficult. And sometimes somebody might end up disagreeing with Ayn Rand, and that's fine, right? You know, it's you have to recognize that who you're disagreeing with is Ayn Rand, but that can lead you to disagree with Ayn Rand. At the end of the day, Rand and all of us want you to be first-handed, want you to figure out, based on these philosophical ideas, how to live your life and what your views are on particular issues. So the same for us. I mean, we're going to come up with our conclusions about these things. We have had robust discussions within the Institute about every one of these stands, and then we often find ourselves in disagreement with objectivists outside, with other objectivist intellectuals, with some of our supporters and donors, and this goes back decades. It goes back, for me, I mean, it became real after 9/11 when we took a strong stance on specifics regarding 9/11 together with Leonard Peikoff. But there were a lot of supporters, donors, even some intellectuals who were associated with the objectivist movement who disagreed. And we were very critical of Bush. I mean, unbelievably critical of Bush for years and years and years. And many supporters of the Ayn Rand Institute were in disagreement with us. They were supportive of Bush. And then even within the board, there were, I remember I gave a talk 2004 or 5. And at the end of the talk, I basically said, if we're not going to fight the war in Iraq properly, we should get up. We should just leave Iraq. And Peter Schwartz ran up to me right afterwards and like, how could you say that? That's, and we disagreed, and it's natural because these are complicated issues. They are, and it's not like we are in a position of making decisions about them. But we, there's going to be robust disagreement about the particulars. Now, as I think Robert said, there's certain issues where it's if you're an objectivist, then it's inappropriate to disagree. Or if you disagree, then you have to understand that you're disagreeing with objectivism. And this relates to the Kelly issue, right? Objectivism is not an open system in the sense that anything you decide that's true is part of objectivism. Objectivism is Ayn Rand's ideas as articulated by her primarily and by Leonard and Opa, and Ominous Parallels, but that's pretty much it. And if so if you disagree with something within the philosophy, if you disagree with Ayn Rand, and then you go and argue that no, that's objectivism, then it's going to become unpleasant, as it did with David Kelly. Then we're going to say, no, in a sense, you're a fraud. You're trying to sell off your ideas as objectivism when objectivism is clearly not that. So those kind of disagreements are one level. Disagreements about philosophy, which are possible, another level. And then there's disagreements about the application, which are, again, on a different level. And it's important to differentiate between those.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and another kind of disagreement or what can engender disagreements is how important is a certain principle of Ayn Rand. So I've met objectivists who agree with Ayn Rand on the issue of abortion again, but they don't think it has the status that she gave it in evaluating presidential candidates. I mean, she said flat out with respect to Reagan that if you deny a woman a right to abortion, you don't understand individual rights. You're not a defender of individual rights, period. And I think I'm quoting the period. Now I've met who say, yeah, I'm against it. I wish, but that's not going to be a deciding factor for me. And so where you place these things in your hierarchy of evaluation is going to be the root of disagreements among objectivists, I think. Or at least I've seen that, so it's not, I think.
Yeah. And I think so I agree with I forget what your 3 levels you're on, but something about if you disagree with
passing off your knowledge as objectivism when it's not, you disagree about philosophy, that can happen, and you disagree about application.
You can make those distinctions, and they're important to make, I think, but often what happens in a disagreement, I think, is you think it's just a disagreement about an issue of application.
Yep.
And it turns out, no, it's a disagreement more at a philosophical level. And then even a disagreement about, no, objectivism, something different. And for the Institute, it matters where we think the disagreement lies. So David Kelly, you put it that we view it as a fraud, but at one level you can think it was a disagreement about an issue of application, about libertarians and who should you deal with. But it became clear in the articulation of, well, no, this is how David Kelly writing, this is how I approach the issue. And Leonard writing, well, yeah, but this is what objectivism says, that it wasn't just in disagreement at the issue of application. It was a philosophical disagreement. And then it even became, no, objectivism's open. You can add to it and even rewrite it, modify it. And the perspective, no, it's objectivism is the name, a proper name of her philosophy. So that's when it becomes fraudulent, when you're trying to pass off your philosophical views as Ayn Rand's. There's something fraudulent about that. So you can make these distinctions, but often in a conflict, what it ends up is, yeah, no, there's a lot of disagreement. The disagreement's wider than you think it is. And I would think abortion is like this often, that they're not getting clearly why Ayn Rand has the position that she has. So they know, yeah, she has a much stronger position than I, but they don't get why her position is like that. And I think the more you get, yeah, these are reasons for it, the more it's, yeah, is there really, so you can have a very different view about the application here?
Right. And I think more broadly, a lot of the disagreements we're seeing nowadays around the election come down to disagreements about, or misunderstanding, I would say, about objectivism's political philosophy, its relationship to conservatism. I think there's a real disagreement among people, or a misunderstanding on the part of some people, of just how different they are. And I think that's what's behind a lot of the disagreements here. People who think we're closer to that camp, and others who.
Well, I think conservatives who get attracted to Ayn Rand and think that they're objectivists, and sometimes in times of stress, their conservatism comes out, and you realize maybe they're not objectivists, maybe they're more conservatives. But I think there's one other element to this disagreement. While I'm very sympathetic to the disagreements, very sympathetic to people coming to different conclusions, I think people also need to be objective. Be objective about what they know in philosophy, be objective about what they know about the world, and have some at least respect for expertise. And it doesn't mean you have to follow the expert. It doesn't mean you have to accept what the expert says. But politics, social media makes it seem like everybody's an expert in politics. Everybody's an expert in philosophy. Everybody's an expert in everything. And that's just not true. If it turns out that I disagree with somebody I respect and agree with 99% of the time, what it causes me to say is, wait a minute, why am I disagreeing with him? Maybe I'm wrong. That doesn't mean I am wrong, and it doesn't mean I'm going to change my mind, but at least it causes me to reflect. And I see so many people so certain of what they know when they have really no basis for their certainty, because they don't have the knowledge, either philosophical or in the concrete matter, to have such a strong opinion and to be so nasty about it, if you will.
Let me introduce one last aspect of this that we can talk about, and then we'll move on to the next topic. But so you brought up 9/11, Yaron. I think it's an interesting case, and it's not different than abortion or libertarianism. Ayn Rand talked about both of these things. She obviously couldn't talk about 9/11. And yet we viewed it at ARI as this is an enormously significant event that we have to spend a lot of time talking about, and we have to develop a position on. And we put a lot of thought into developing the positions. And thinking of ARI as an organization, and that we have conferences, we have people speaking for us at different events. And it wasn't as though we sort of laid down some law. This is at any conference or talk, and if someone asks about this, this is what you need to say and something like that. But on the other hand, we thought, look, this takes a lot of philosophical thinking, and to view this issue from an objectivist perspective, not to either succumbing to the liberal kind of view about what is going on about and how to think about Islam, but not to think also the conservative. You brought this up about, Robert, that, I mean, objectivism is not anything like conservatism. And the more we think of someone as, no, they're really approaching it like that, the more circumspect we are about, okay, can they speak on this issue at ARI events? And this is with Robert Trezinski. I mean, this was one of the issues. He was a writer for ARI and for a period of time, and there was growing disagreement about 9/11, how to think about it, how to think about the Republicans, how to think about Bush. And at some point, and I think it was mutual, it was some point, we disagree so much, and it's not just a complex issue of application. It's actually at the level of what are the principles that it doesn't make any sense for you to be speaking for ARI anymore, because we don't think this is at all how to approach the issue. And that, I mean, that is, again, inherent, I think, to what ARI as an organization does.
Can I say one more thing about?
We have to constantly evaluate our speakers, intellectuals we work with, and you know, that in and of itself is hard, and we have to make the calls in terms of when is a disagreement so significant that we're not going to work together, and when is it, you know, not as big of a deal, and therefore you know, we can work together. And we do that with other organizations, other intellectuals, and other objectivists as well.
And one other point, I mean, to make it real how difficult issues can be. I mean, Ayn Rand at one point was asked about gun control, and I think her response was something like, that's a difficult issue. On the one hand, on the other, you know, on the one hand, this is something that's for killing. On the other hand, you have to have a right to self. So she saw that this required an investment, you know, in time, in research, and thinking about the issue, and she hadn't done it, and I don't think was terribly interested in doing it. She didn't regard it as a really central issue, and that itself might be a basis of a disagreement here. One other thing, I think someone in the chat is concerned that we're not talking about elections. I will make one point in connection with disagreement. Ayn Rand was aware that an election was something really important, and her audience wasn't, when she was speaking to objectivists, she treated us as, or them, I wasn't kind of around when she was talking about these things, as respectful adults about to make a very important decision. So if you look, she'll talk about, she had one publication called A Suggestion, which seems, you know, very polite about an election. At another point, when she's discussing the 1968 election between Hubert Humphrey and Nixon, she says something about the fact that if you understand Humphrey, it should be obvious that you should vote for Nixon or abstain. So she's aware that these are complicated issues. People are coming from them from different backgrounds, and that there might be a real basis for disagreement among decent, good people about what to do in that particular election. I don't know what she'd say about this one.
Well, I think I know.
Well, I was being polite.
Okay, so let's turn to that issue, though. I'll just say, I mean, we were talking about 9/11. If you don't think your analysis of 9/11 should impact how you think about the elections from 2004 to 2008, and so I mean, this is part of what should go into thinking about the candidates who actually represents my view or part of my view and so on. But let's turn now directly to the issue of the way that each of us interpret Ayn Rand's thinking about the elections. As I said at the outset, she spent a lot of time writing about the issues, at least from Kennedy on, thinking about the administrations, thinking about elections, and their meaning for the direction of the culture. So she didn't think they were the cause of the direction, but they tell you something, and they can be a contributory cause. So let's turn to that, and then the last issue is then to bring it up to the president and how we think about it. But I think it's worth spending some time on how we interpret Ayn Rand's approach to these issues.
One thing I'd like to mention, only because I've been surprised at how little discussion there is about abstaining from voting. And and my approach, and since I've abstained on presidential elections more than I've done anything else, I've taken it very seriously. And I gave a lot of thought when I heard her give the Q&A, and it's published as well in one of the later works where she talks about that abstaining from voting is itself a kind of voting. You're choosing none of the above. And she speaks with the principle of that there are limits to the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
And that there has to be something positive there, even if it is an evil, right? There has to be something positive, something of value. And if you don't have that, you ought not to vote. And I never see it, or I rarely have. And so I usually abstain in presidential elections, and I will this time. I don't know if I'm giving anything away. But that's, I think, something that people ought to seriously consider. I've seen discussions, well, I don't know if I could vote for either of these two. Maybe I'll vote for the Libertarian, or maybe this. Yeah. This is a possible, this is one that you ought to consider. And part of the reason is that for me, it's almost an aesthetic choice or a sanction issue. I could not see myself doing a calculus and figure, okay, I'd rather this guy win. I have a preference for who I'd like to see win, but I couldn't for the life of me vote for someone, because it's a stamp of approval, even if it's a very, the impression is very slight. And so, and I think that's something that people need to consider more, at least in my discussions with people.
Yeah, I think I agree completely with that. But if we go back to Ayn Rand and her commentary, she writes a lot about presidents and about what they're doing and what it represents and what it signifies, both about them and the philosophy that animates them, or the lack of one, and about the culture which tolerates what they're doing and where this would help, where this will lead to. She also talks a lot about the long-term consequences of both presidential actions and the outcomes of particular elections. So she's always thinking about down the road. And in particular, if you think about Reagan and you think about her opposition to voting for Reagan, particularly in 1980, when it was a clear choice between him and Jimmy Carter. That should be pretty simple, right? But she sees the long-term consequences, and I think we're actually living them right now. The long-term consequences of Reagan winning. And the long-term consequences in that case were bringing the moral majority, bringing religion, bringing evangelical Christianity into the heart of the Republican Party and allowing it to define who the Republican Party is. And then she's saying, if that's the Republican Party, then that's destroyed that party, and we know where the Democrats are, so it leaves nothing, right? And so the only hope to save the Republican Party, in a sense, is to reject Ronald Reagan, to reject, and by doing that, reject the religious right. So she's always thinking ahead. She's thinking strategically, what's the result going to be, culturally, for the country and for the politics of it. So she's constantly, Anka's right. Politics is shaped by the culture, but she recognized that politics also shapes the culture. And I think we could definitely talk about how Donald Trump in particular has shaped the culture, or even how Obama shaped the culture to make Donald Trump possible. But there's definitely it goes in both directions. It's not just one way.
And she was worried about that very early on. There's a letter to Barry Goldwater from 1960 where she says something like, what the communists have done to the liberals, the religionists, and I think she even uses an odd expression like the professional religionists, are doing to the conservatives. And I take that to mean bringing them in a bad direction. kind of the logical consequences of them. And that was 1960. She was trying to make Goldwater better. And she saw what was going to happen or what could happen if it wasn't resisted. And she got Reagan. I mean, in a way, well, she had to live through that.
Yeah, so I think it's worth talking more about how she thought about both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party over time. It's worth saying on the conservatism issue, I mean, her major article on this conservatism, an obituary, brings this up explicitly, that tying the supposed advocacy of some element of freedom, of individual rights and capitalism, tying it to faith and to religion is worse than saying nothing. So, and this is often in her writings, that a bad argument is worse than saying nothing because it makes it seem like reason's on the other side. So if all you have to say for freedom and capitalism is, well, it's in the Bible or some variant of that, then it's, we want to go by reason and science. So I guess we need some other system if that's what we're going to do. And it strengthens the opposing and evil side. And I think that is, she comments about that often, and not just sort of the dynamic between Republicans and Democrats, but this of defenders of freedom. I mean, she was really, really critical of John Stuart Mill. And in some ways, I think you can think of him, and he's trying to defend freedom of speech and so on. But she thinks the argument's so bad that you make the other side look good, because this is the best argument for the good side. So let's try something else. I want to say something on the issue of what you brought up at the start, Robert, about abstaining and looking for a positive value. Part of the way that I think about it, but I think what she's emphasizing is we're in a representative form of government. So you talked about it as a sanction, and you are, in choosing to vote for someone, I think you're saying this person represents me. Now, she writes, in a two-party system, it can't be that if you vote for someone, that means all his views represent all your views and so on. But it's still a representative form of government. And if you really think, no, this person doesn't represent anything of what I stand for, it's just he's not as bad as who the other person is, you have to really think, is it proper to vote for him? And I think this is part of the issue of that she says there's limits to the lesser of two evils. And it's particular when one's thinking about election, where it's, you're saying something positive, that this person represents some of my views, that you can't back away from that and say, no, that's not what my vote means. That's what a vote means in a representative system of government. And I think that's one of the reasons that you have to, it has to be a live option that I'm going to abstain.
And of course, her view was that because it's representative government, the president does represent you. And that's why it's important to have an opinion. That is, even if you abstain, it's important to know what the issues are. It's important to know who the good guys or the bad guys, or that everybody's a bad guy. It's important to know what's going on. It's important to be involved and to care, because whether you like it or not, they represent you and their actions affect you, right? Their actions are going to have a profound impact, or potentially a profound impact on your life. So it's important to be engaged in the political process, even though I think she would be horrified by how obsessed people are with the political process today. I mean, everything is politicized. It's constant. People talk about almost nothing else.
Well, she says that's true every 4 years. How does she put that? Yeah, she said there's kind of, on the one hand, I can't find the issue.
I know what you mean, though, because she said something like, on the one hand, people dismiss elections, they're not important, I don't need to pay attention. Or the other side is, the whole nation hinges on what happens on November 2nd.
If Hillary's elected, then that's so. Yeah, there's a lot of that. Could I wanted to say one more thing about, well, maybe more than one thing about conservatives, or we're going to return to.
Well, yeah, I thought we should talk a little bit. I mean, she was, I forget who of you brought up Goldwater, but she was supported Goldwater's run for the president. She wrote a fair amount about it, but she also wrote about why he lost a landslide against him, and lessons to draw from that, that I think in terms of thinking of the trajectory of the Republican Party, that she goes from supporting Goldwater to being adamant against Reagan. It's worth talking a little bit about that trajectory.
And I was going to go back even further, because it's not as if she was a conservative for a long time and then got disgusted with Reagan or something like that. If you go back, she worked for the Wendell Willkie campaign in 1940, I think. And she said somewhere, I think it's in the biographical interviews maybe, that his compromise, that he started out as this opponent of the New Deal, and then he became a compromiser, and he was worse than Roosevelt for that. I mean, guiltier, she says. So she was disgusted with, and she talks not just about Willkie, but the people around him in the Republican Party. And these are conservatives, and they're middle of the road. They're not being principled. There's some better ones, but not enough of them, and they're not the ones who really matter in the party. When she was she became involved in the anti-communism and HUAC and all that, and same thing. She was disgusted with the conservatives because they wanted to attack people rather than deal with ideas. She's really negative about Eisenhower, and she didn't like Taft. That was the son of the President Taft, who ran.
She didn't vote for Eisenhower, right? She didn't vote in those
elections. She didn't vote for him, but he was. She regarded I think it's the 52 election where the Republican was Robert Taft and Eisenhower, and the Republicans, they gave it to Eisenhower, who was pro. We need the welfare state. We're so far on, because that's a conservative, right? You accept what happened last generation. And where Taft, who she didn't like all that much, I mean, he'd be a giant now, but she thought he was clearly a better opponent. And then the Republicans, and she was even annoyed at people like Hazlitt and some of these others who were around for not being negative enough. So her dissatisfaction with the conservatives, you have a life before you have an obituary. And I mean, it went way back. And she's a Cassandra in a way. She saw what happened with the Republican Party. And I mean, I think, putting everything else aside, she might have rejected Trump merely for his choice of VP. Because that was doing exactly what Reagan did. Reagan wasn't terribly religious. I remember Jesse Jackson criticizing him for being not really religious, so it's all hypocritical. But he unleashed into the culture the moral majority, made abortion a serious issue again. Anyway, that's I wanted a trajectory with the conservatives, because I think there was this idea that clearly she thought the liberals were over here and the conservatives are here. They got this little issue with religion, and I don't think it's that way at all.
But what's interesting about her is that she learned this from experience. That is, she chose to engage. She engaged in politics. She worked in campaigns. She engaged in intellectual cooperation with other free marketers. And she repeatedly was disappointed by their lack of principle, by the fact that they were not consistent, the fact that they constantly compromised. And so she gained many of these opinions about conservatives from real experience in dealing with them and in interacting with them. And it wasn't that she was always on the sidelines and just complaining from the sidelines or criticizing from the sidelines. She tried to engage and saw from the inside how corrupt they really were. And I think it made her critique so much more powerful.
Let's talk a little bit about the Goldwater, that she thought that he's someone who's articulating principles that are pro-freedom, pro-capitalism. She doesn't think that he's an advocate of laissez-faire capitalism, but as on the political scene of the 60s, that he was unusual in that he seemed principled. She was very cautious even early on about, can you really have a campaign like this where you simultaneously have to campaign and educate the public about what these principles actually mean. So it's very difficult. It's not clear Goldwater is up to the task. But even with all those caveats, she was disappointed, to say the least, in Goldwater. And one of her comments about it is that he had this chance where he could talk to the country about some crucial issues and frame them on as matters of principle, and that the campaign disintegrated into he has nothing to say. And that was one of the, he had literally nothing to say, is sort of shop-worn, hackneyed, I don't know what the right adjective is, but it's sort of the precursor of bringing in, oh, it's all about family and that's all you need is love. It's so unintellectual.
But that's so typical of conservatives. They can quote the Constitution. They can even, the better ones can even talk about individual rights without defining them, without really explaining them. They can say they're pro-capitalism. But as soon as it gets to any real application, as soon as it gets to any real issue, their altruism, their collectivism immediately comes forward, and all the principles that they articulated, are gone. They disappear. And then, when they're actually in front of voters, they're going to talk more about, the stuff that the non-intellectual stuff that appeals to the voters. And I think what happened with Goldwater is, I think he did have an opportunity. I mean, she really despised Kennedy primarily because of what a pragmatist he was. He didn't believe in anything. He didn't stand for anything. He was unprincipled, although in comparison to what's going on today, he seems like the paragon of virtue. But I mean, she calls him out. I mean, she argues that he's leading the country towards fascism, I mean, again, if you compare to anything today, and you think she'd just sit by and when you were so negative on Kennedy, and then by contrast, here's Goldwater, who at least says in parts of his speeches principled things that are consistent with America. It was night and day in many respects, and you can understand why she was enthusiastic. But she also was cautious because she knew religion was in the background. She knew that, yes, that when he's pushed, he immediately reverts to these non-essentials and unprincipled positions. And it turned out to be a tragedy because he lost. He didn't just lose; he lost in a landslide, which basically taught the Republican Party, don't go even with the people who have a little bit of principle, right? Go with the complete pragmatist. And it's not an accident at all that the next candidate the Republicans put up is Nixon, the ultimate Republican pragmatist. Principles don't matter. Principles don't count. And I think that was the beginning of the end. And I think she viewed it as the beginning of the end of whatever good there was in the Republican Party was gone after that. Whatever good there might have been in conservatism was gone after that.
Have you ever seen the map of what states went with Goldwater? It's Arizona, his own state, and then the South. And she once referred to the Republican National Committee or the Republican handlers as an evil that we can't seem to shake or something like that. Because I think that might have been in connection with Ford becoming just a non-entity against Carter and losing. But what they picked up from, I think Ankur's talked about this in the lecture, right, where it was the Southern Christians. And so some bright Republican got the idea, this is how we win elections. We get the Christian vote. And they didn't get in, well, 68 wasn't really an issue, but after, once Reagan came along in 76, it was big.
Well, let's talk a little bit about so we've been talking more on the Republican side, though, Ron, you brought up Kennedy and that she was very negative of Kennedy, that she, as you said, she saw him as this is burgeoning fascism. And it's that he's anti-ideology, that he's trying to put an end to ideological debate in the country. And I think this is also that the failing of Goldwater is that he could raise ideological issues, and it seemed like he was, and then he completely retreated from that.
Yep.
So now it's both sides are anti-ideology in a certain way, or have given up at least on ideology. I mean, she was critical of LBJ, and then she's critical of Nixon, but in the Nixon-McGovern election, she says McGovern is so bad, and so bad here means he's a representative of the new left. He's the candidate they want. This is his source of power, of any moral fervor behind his campaign. This is it. And that it's the first explicit time that statism as statism, like give government incredible power, expropriate wealth, comes on sort of the political platform. And she thinks in that context, she said, yeah, no, Nixon's really bad, but this was a case of, given how bad or how evil the alternative is, you have to vote for Nixon. And she came out that you should vote for Nixon. But I think this is important because in terms of the trajectory into when you get to Reagan and her attitude towards Reagan, I think it's important to get that this is what she thought about McGovern, and that she was, I mean, you guys can talk about this a little more. She was very positive that McGovern lost in a landslide, that it was a landslide against him. And she starts using the term swing to the right. And I think she thinks there's a tremendous opportunity that Reagan completely betrays. But we can talk about that second amount. But let's talk a little bit about the McGovern-Nixon.
But it's even the case that the McGovern loss swung the Democratic Party to the right. And I think that's important. And it's why she could, in a sense, afford not to vote for Reagan, because as bad as Jimmy Carter was, he wasn't a representative of the new left. He wasn't an all-out statist in a sense that McGovern was. She might have been pro-Reagan if I don't know this, if it was against McGovern, if it was against a McGovern-like
candidate. She actually said that.
Wasn't.
She actually said that the only reason you could vote for Reagan is if the Democrats run someone like McGovern against.
Yeah, and they didn't. And the reason they didn't, I almost said Clinton, because Clinton's the same kind of candidate. It's because the Democratic Party swung to the right after McGovern. His defeat in a landslide actually changed the dynamics within the Democratic Party, and Jimmy Carter, and later on Bill Clinton, and I'd say, to this day, the presidential candidates that the Democratic Party has put forward, I can't think of anyone who really represented the kind of the McGovern winning of the Democratic Party. None of them, including Biden, is a new left. They're all marginally more statist every round, but that's just the direction of history. But none of them are the completely far left, what she considered the far left and the new left that McGovern represented, which she thought would unquestionably destroy this country. And you could bring it to date and you can say, yeah, you can see McGovern-like elements within the Democratic Party. They're pretty strong. They're probably, they're pretty strong today. It's surprising it's their candidate who is not representing the Democratic Party right now, but they are strong. But they still haven't taken over that party any more than they did in '72, and they haven't since. So that defeat of McGovern and arguing for, turns out to be, really, really important in, I think, the modern history of the United States. I think it was crucial for the preservation of this country, whatever elements of freedom that we have, and she was right on the money, as she almost always was.
I think, and it's important, I think, to go back to '68, and which was in a way the Democratic convention in Chicago. That was a big event where you had the hippies, the protests. You had this movement, the New Left, with the Black Panthers and all these elements, and they had people in the party that supported them. And I think the younger people were hoping that they would become the candidate, of the Democratic Party. What they got was Hubert Humphrey, which is the Biden of the time. I think he's the analog of Biden because he was a milquetoast nothing, a cipher, a non-entity, and he puts his foot in his mouth every time he spoke. Whereas 72, that's what they got. this was the culmination of the new left, the student revolution, all that communist BS. I mean, to the extent that it could appear in America, they got McGovern, and McGovern won Massachusetts and DC. I mean, it was a real, it was, Good Morning America. I forgot how she put it when she gave the talk after that election. She was very pleased because this was a definite no, and a no not only from the Republicans, but from, as Yaron pointed out, the Democrats. And so I think if you're going to use the analogy, which I hear every 4 years, Ayn Rand said that if there were an organization called Anti-Nixonites for Nixon, she would join that organization. You can't just say every time a Republican who's really creepy runs against a Democrat that principle applies. It applies, you would have to have, I think it would work if you had Bernie Sanders.
Yep.
If you had, Bernie Sanders versus Mitt Romney or one of the regular Republicans, we can talk about Trump later, then I think that would be it would be the same kind of thing, because I think Bernie Sanders represents that. In fact, he's supposed to be progressive. He's your grandfather's socialist. But that's a different kind of candidate. But it's not the case that Hillary Clinton was not as awful, and I think she's closer to Nixon than she was to McGovern.
Think about how
the case of every Democrat.
Yeah. Think about how bad Nixon was. I mean, many of the alphabet agencies we have today were Nixon's. He did price controls.
Price and wage.
He went off the gold standard.
China.
The amount of bad stuff that Nixon did is hard to imagine any president doing in terms of, but the alternative was so despicable, so bad, right, that at that point there was no alternative, there was no choice.
And ideologically bad.
Yes, it was an ideology. Nixon was just a pragmatist. He didn't know what he was doing with price controls. I mean, he had no clue what he was doing with going off the gold standard. And it was all shots in the dark. It was all pragmatism. It was all trying to fix problems. Whereas McGovern was an ideologue with a specific, clear ideology. And just a parallel to today, I think that if Biden loses, I think it will be like 68. I think the next candidate the Democrats put up is going to be a far left candidate, because Hillary lost, who's considered a centrist. Biden loses a centrist. Now the far left has every reason to say, we've tried being moderate. Let's go all out. And somebody like, it won't be AOC, but somebody of AOC's caliber becomes their candidate.
I have a different view of that. I think we're likely going to get a further towards socialism candidate, sort of explicitly, regardless of Biden wins or loses. But we're going to come to the present and some of these comparisons. But I want to get two last things about sort of Ayn Rand's views. So on this anti-Nixonites for Nixon, the first part is really important, that she's anti-Nixon and articulates all what's evil about it. Not he's pretty good, he's evil.
Long essays on how bad he is. I mean, long discussions about how bad he is.
And I don't think you can credibly hold that position unless, it just seems like, oh yeah, okay, that's your position, but you're really pro-Nixon. Yeah. You really have to articulate what is wrong with him and then say, but I still think you should vote for him, which is what she did. And she became even more negative than Nixon after he was elected. I've seen some people bring up, well, he might be good on the Supreme Court. And she did say that on nominees. But then she said, he's not. It turns out he wasn't even good on this when you get the things about censorship, the cases. So it's clear she's anti-Nixon. So that's one. But I want to talk. So the last thing in terms of thinking of the trajectory, I think so. With the landslide against McGovern and the rejection of the new left candidate, when it's presented as he's the representative of the new left, she thought that this puts the new left on the retreat. And the swing to the right is in the country is a kind of the American spirit exerting itself. And if this is what the Democrats are about, and so we don't want this. And so there's a tremendous opportunity on the side of the right. And the only way they're going to lose it is if they screw it up, not the new left's going to become super attractive and Americans are going to move. So you could have had, take a comparison, so to make it not unrealistic, you could have had a Margaret Thatcher who doesn't cozy up to religion and so on. And I think she would have supported that. But Absolutely. Here you have the swing to the right, and what you get immediately is the tying of supposedly pro-freedom, pro-capitalism, fiscally responsible, strong foreign policy. All of it is grounded. What is our argument? It's grounded in religion and faith. And there's no greater way to hand the power back to the new left than to do that. I think. And so when she's talking longer term, this is going to be a disaster. I think part of the disaster is you're going to discredit the swing to the right. And then if you get a swing back to the left, don't be so surprised. Sort of the new left elements. And I think that's what we're living through now. It's when you think of Clinton, they're so on the defensive. They won't even use the term liberal. That's become bad. Yeah. And it's the era of big government is over and so on. And what revives it? It's the worse than bankruptcy on the right. So like Goldwater's bankrupt. He has nothing to say. Reagan has something to say, sort of at a philosophical level, and it's all bad.
Yes, I mean, even though Goldwater attributes his defense of capitalism to religion, it's not central to his campaign at all. It's when he's forced to defend it, all he can do is go to religion. With Reagan, it is front and center. He is courting and clearly going after the new evangelical voters and trying to appease them and appeal to them and bring them in, not just to vote for him, but bring them into the Republican Party, to leadership positions, to a part of the institution. And that's what has this long-term effect. But yeah, I mean, she saw it. She saw it not just in terms of the right getting worse, but she saw it in terms of the resurrection of the left. Because to a large extent, the new left, seemingly at least, had disappeared, certainly as a political force, by the mid-1980s and into the 90s. And you saw that here. You saw it in the UK, right? The UK, you got the same thing. You had a swing to the right. The left became, in the Labour Party agenda in the 90s, they took out any reference to anything that might be perceived as Marxist, because they were so. And it's only the failure of the right, it's only the complete moral capitulation of the right that resurrected kind of socialist elements within the left in the UK and the new left in the United States. It's the right's fault that the left has become as dominant as it is, because the right has been so pathetic.
And I think just so now sort of we're moving away from Rand's own views. She died in the early 80s, to thinking what's happened since then and to the present. But just sort of her warning that this is going to destroy the right. I think just in terms of presidential candidates, if you go from Reagan to Bush Sr. to Bush Jr. to
Trump, Bob Dole in the middle.
Yeah, he doesn't win, but just of who, what, you go down. It's a straight downward path. And this is what she thought, I think, was going to happen.
And Bush was an empty candidate. He stood for nothing, compassionate conservatism. So he had internalized religion so much, it was so part of him. He was ultimately born again, that he was feeble in even his attempts to defend anything. I mean, I think we all longed by that point for Reagan, who at least could give a speech and could articulate some of these ideas. Bush was a nothing, really an empty suit to a large extent. And you saw that in the great time of, he was challenged twice. I mean, there were two big challenges for the Bush. One was 9/11. And while most of the country for a while thought he did a good job, ultimately, I think history will evaluate him as a complete failure. And the second was the financial crisis, which I think in some respect, he did more damage than even with 9/11, where it was a complete disaster. He was going to save capitalism by destroying, by regulating and controlling it and destroying it. And it completely opened the door to what we're seeing today politically in terms of the dominance of the far left in American politics. I think Obama could have never become president if not for Bush's second term. When we talk about strategic voting, I did vote. My first vote ever in the United States, because I became a citizen in 2003. I actually voted for John Kerry in 2004 because I was so disgusted with Bush's response primarily to 9/11. And now I kind of have this fantasy of what would have happened if John Kerry would have won. And put aside the whole Iraq thing, which I think would have been blamed on him and it would have played out differently. But think of if John Kerry was president during the financial crisis. And it wouldn't have been so easily and straightforwardly blamed on the right and on capitalism and on Republicans and on everything like that. You would have never had Obama and you would have never had Trump. So I am happier with my vote in 2004 than I was when I did it then, looking back on kind of the scenarios or what if. Now, who knows what would have happened, but it at least seems like defeating Bush then would have saved us from a lot of trouble today.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Ayn Rand makes the point when she's discussing, she surprised a lot of people by coming out claiming that she was intending to vote for Patrick Moynihan, the Democratic senator from New York, against James Buckley, the conservative, the religious conservative. And one of the points she makes a lot of points. She raises the same principle about his being anti-abortion and what that implies. But she also mentions that if Moynihan screws things up, and we would kill for a Democrat like Moynihan, I think nowadays. If he screwed things up, it embarrasses the left, it embarrasses them. If Buckley screws things up, it's us. It's because we're tainted with their brush because these are allies. And in some sense, clearly, there are people on the right who've been allies, at least in the realm of economics and political philosophy. And that's something important to keep in mind. And I think it's what, Trump isn't doing us any favors as far as reputation is concerned. That's for sure. The reputation of whatever you could consider the right.
Yeah, and there was arguments to be made about certainly not voting for Bush Senior, after Reagan, because again, he was such milquetoast and he stood for nothing. And didn't Rand also say, look, that and I think that both parties basically stand for nothing. That is, that they have no identity in a sense, that it's just a mishmash of various forms of pragmatism with leaning in different directions. And the pragmatists have dominated these political parties. That it's been a long time since there were any principles in either one. And until the Democratic Party goes all socialist, and then there'll be some principles.
She made a very fascinating philosophical dissection of the left and the right I think it was mid-70s, 75, perhaps, Censorship, Local and Express. I think that's where she makes that distinction, where she says the left and the right both advocate and I think this is an interesting thing to bring up to see to what extent they're both changing. The left and the right, they both accept the mind-body or soul-body dichotomy, and they each grant freedom to that side of the dichotomy that they don't value. So the left, they're mystics of muscle. They want to regulate the economy, regulate the material world, and you're free, academic freedom and free speech and all that stuff. And the conservatives are mystics of the spirit. They want to leave you free in the marketplace, but they want to control, no pornography, what you do with your body, abortion and things like that. And what's interesting to me is I think that was a brilliant description of she said, there's this apparent contradiction. The left claims to be pro-freedom in this area, but not that, and vice versa. But there is no soul-body dichotomy. there isn't, you can't keep them separate like that. And I think what you see is both the left and the right are getting worse in the area that they used to be. I mean, the left is worse than the right, certainly in academia where I reside, on the issue of freedom of expression. The left is really bad. They're awful. And the right, who's the defending laissez-faire capitalism? No one. And they've come together. The perfect example of that, I think, is the media, the social media, what the left and the right, what the Republicans and the Democrats did to Facebook, Amazon, etc. Zuckerberg, when they had them, they were grilling them. It's descended something terrible. And I think, again, she's long regarded, she's had these serious criticisms of the right as well as the left.
And no, you're absolutely right in terms of the mind-body dichotomy, because it doesn't exist. They can't sustain the separation, and they also can't sustain, mixtures don't sustain, right? They either go towards more authoritarianism or towards more freedom, and both political parties have gone towards more authoritarianism. And that is now reflected across the board and every issue. The response from both political parties is more authoritarian.
And if you think of that dynamic, I mean, part of her analysis, I think, was they want to control the realm that they think of as metaphysically significant. But their major premise is, I want to control.
Yep.
And you can have freedom in this realm that doesn't matter. And to say there's no mind-body dichotomy is part of that is to say, or no soul-body dichotomy, she sometimes puts it like that too. To say that there's no dichotomy is that if you want to control this realm, you have to control the other realm too. And if you were pro-freedom, it would be, oh, really? But I want freedom of speech. And so maybe I should drop the controlling part. But if what's driving you is I want to control, then take it on the side of the Democrats against social media. It's I want to control money, economic power, and if that means, then I've got to violate freedom of speech and not. I'm going to do that because what's driving me is I want to control this. And same the other direction, that if you take a Ted Cruz and I want to control the spiritual and put religion back in, and if that means treating businessmen like, well, maybe they don't have freedom and maybe they're the enemy. Yeah, okay, because I want to control this. And if what's driving you is the control, then it's when the contradiction becomes apparent, you're going to resolve it in a certain way. And I think part of what we're seeing is, they resolve it into, I guess we have to control everything. Let's talk, there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about in regard to the present situation and Republicans, Democrats. We've talked a little bit about right and left. I no longer think in those terms because I don't think the right, particularly the right, designates anything. And it's not clear to anybody even what I'm talking about. And if it means religiosity and so on, it has nothing to do with freedom or capitalism. But I want to talk a little bit, and this relates to the issue of abortion. And I think the way that I interpret Rand's view on this, and that's the nihilism. So there's a kind of view that there's only nihilism on the left, as it would be put. Like, as I said, I don't think about this, but even if you put it as like there's nihilism in the Democratic Party, but not in the Republican Party. My interpretation of part of her view of abortion and why she viewed this as such a significant issue is that she sees it as in motivation, an expression of nihilism. That is, nobody gains from restricting abortion. And that's one of the ways she put it, if I can find quickly the quote because this is part of when she talked a number of times about Reagan. And in one of them, this is the way she put it after talking about that if he opposes abortion, he can't be on the side of individual rights. But then I think it's a deeper point she's making. This is what she writes. This is in I think 75 or 76. It's late 75 or early 70s, 1976. Quote, not every wrong idea is an indication of a fundamental philosophical evil in a person's convictions. The anti-abortion stand is such an indication. There is no room for an error of knowledge in this issue and no venal excuse. The anti-abortion stand is horrifying because it is non-venal, because no one has anything to gain from it, and therefore its motive is pure ill will toward mankind. Close quote. And I think the pure ill will towards mankind that's an expression of nihilism. And I think she did not think she certainly thought there's nihilism on the New Left, but I don't think she thought of nihilism as restricted to it's only the New Left. And I don't view it as in the present that it's only sort of the current representatives of the New Left, that there's nihilism there. I think that the nihilism, unfortunately, is more widespread in terms of motivation than that. But I'm interested in what you guys think about that.
Well, I definitely think it comes up in the abortion debate. I see it as you know, I did a show when abortion came up, and we were talking about abortion, and the comments on the chat very quickly went to, well, if people have, you know, the consequences to sex, and you know, life shouldn't be easy, and it's not easy. It's this almost Jordan Peterson like life needs to, you know, you need to be responsible because life sucks, and you need to suck it up. And if you have sex, you're gonna. And it's almost like this anti-pleasure, anti-sex attitude, which I think animates a lot of people on the right. I think it animates Christianity, so it's not surprising that would animate people on the right. So there's definitely this resentment of this gives people more sexual freedom. Abortion gives people the ability to have an abortion, gives people more sexual freedom. And we want to destroy that. We want to do away with that. It gives women more control over their lives, more control over their careers, more control over their sex, more control over their activities, and people resent that and want, particularly men, and they want to shut it down. So I definitely think that the nihilism comes across in the abortion debate very quickly when you push people. You know, there's only so much you can argue about, you know, clump of cells versus third trimester and stuff. When you really push them, it goes all the way back to conception. It goes all the way back to this attitude towards sex. And then you see it everywhere. I mean, particularly today. And I think what characterizes Trump, the Trump and his supporters, his rabid supporters towards economic issues, there's a real nihilism there, or real lose-lose kind of attitudes. It's like, you know, why tariffs on Canadian steel or Canadian aluminum or whatever? So what if people lose their jobs? We have to have America or whatever. It's a real uncaring attitude towards prosperity, towards economic growth, towards economic success, towards many of Americans' quality and standard of living. When I say stuff like Walmart and whatever you think of China, it has raised the standard of living in Americans. All you care about is those material, you know, all you care about is, no, standard of living is really, really important. It's about part of life. So there's definitely this flippant attitude towards the real consequence of actions to individual lives. They don't care about it.
Sorry. And it's there's a deeper issue here, of course, that it's not just the abortion issue. If you talk about religion, and her view of religion, and you, again, I've encountered this recently, where religion isn't as bad as X, you know, on the left, or nihilism. Ayn Rand, I mean, going back to We the Living, to her first entry in her philosophical journals, religion is what places all value into a non-existent realm. And that's got to be a kind of nihilism. It's at least a nihilism as far as your life here on Earth is concerned. And that's why, I mean, Kira puts it in those terms of, you know, I ask people if they believe in God, because if they say they believe in God, I know they don't believe in life. Well, that's
nothing more nihilistic than that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just the form, since it's such a structure, a hierarchy of beliefs, of values, of, you know, they're definitely have a moral code, but that is a veneer that's become really, really thin in the 21st century.
One of the things so going back to the 2016 election, one of the things that I found most depressing about it was that I think the two candidates that got sort of enthusiastic, you might even say rabid support, were Sanders and Trump. And I think on both of them, there's a nihilism there that what really animates is what they're against and what they want to destroy, tear down. I want to get the Wall Street and the bankers for the Bernie Sanders kind of and business. And the Trump, it was, we're going to go after the immigrants. And it was, it's not like this was the first time there's negative campaigning in US elections, but that the core of the message and what seemed to resonate was the negative. This is like, I'm pointing out large swaths of the American electorate and saying they're evil, we're going to go after them. And there's, I mean, I think they function as scapegoats in this, but this is what gets real support, not, oh my God, we have to pick between two candidates who are nihilists. It's both sides are supporting what I think of as it's a tearing down of real values. And to me, it was the first, and I think, I mean, it's extended into the present, that what animates the Democrat, I agree, I don't think Biden is a nihilist, but I think he's my interpretation of his victory is we can't run the candidate that we want to run now. Might not even run for if he gets elected, might not even run for re-election. So he won't have 2 terms. It'll be 1 term. And he's a kind of stopgap that of sort of the direction of the party's animated by Sanders, Warren, AOC, like that wing that's really scapegoats. So to me, that there's a growing nihilism that is the most frightening thing that I find in the sort of the two parties.
Well, there's a growing nihilism and there's a growing authoritarianism, and everything you said about the campaign in 2016 fits the authoritarian label as well. I mean, typically the way authoritarians run is things are awful. It's not your fault. It's the fault of the other. And I'm the guy who can fix it. And and just take Sanders and Trump, and they both ran exactly that. They just blamed it. Everything's bad. They had exactly the same examples. Then who they blamed for were different. And then, Trump, I can fix it. Sanders, democratic socialism can fix it. Socialism can fix it. But it, it's not even real socialism. What he was talking about was not. It's also he can fix it. And that is the kind of authoritarianism that dominates today both political parties. And it's like most authoritarianism, it's not about a positive message. It's all about a negative message. It's all about we have to, shut these people out. We have to kick these people out. We have to stop these people. The whole campaign is all about negativity. And I agree with you on the Democratic Party to some extent. I do think that if they know that if they nominated somebody like AOC, they couldn't win. So people who vote Democratic are not way out there on the left. They're not denialists. But the committed Democrats are nihilists. So they have to have a Biden who's basically just a pragmatist. He's a centrist. He stands for nothing. But he is at least he's electable in the sense that the American people I still believe that McGovern would lose today, right? I still think that the country would not accept socialism. But what I think Trump's election has proven, and this is why Sanders was never elected, what I think what Trump's election proved is they will accept that authoritarian mindset. They will accept the control. They will accept the kind of mindlessness and nihilism from the right, even if they won't accept it from the left. And that's what scares me about Trump and the whole Trump phenomena is that people will people buy into it and people embrace it and accept it.
There's a difference in the nihilisms in the sense that Sanders does have an ideology and Trump doesn't have it. He has no ideas. I don't even think he's a racist. I think he's, in the sense that he holds ideas that you could counter. I think he's happy to push those buttons if it'll help him get elected, or say the opposite. But I think there will be a socialist candidate eventually if we don't get some serious opposition, and partly because of the universities. The ideas are so bad, and there is no representative of Trump or any kind of ideas of that sort that are teaching in humanities departments. But I don't. So I'm not comfortable about Biden. I agree. I think he's this placeholder, and I'm going to agree for the first time in my life with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky has endorsed Biden, and he says this is a Salon interview. Your support for Biden is more than merely grudging. You actually seem to think that the platform is surprisingly good, given who he is and given where we are. And Chomsky agrees with that and adds, this is not support for Biden. It's support for the activists who have been at work constantly, blah, blah, blah. And then he talks about Sanders. And he said, if you'd asked me 10 years ago whether someone like Bernie Sanders could be the most popular political figure in the country, I would have said you're out of your mind. But in fact, it happened in 2016. And, in effect, we have to run with it. And if you look at his, what are these called? These unity task forces that Biden, because the Democratic Party wanted to show unity between Biden and Sanders. Every one of the six of them, immigration and climate change and employment, whatever it is. And they all have a Biden person, like AOC, I think, was given the
Sanders person.
I don't regard, this is where I would disagree with some objectivists who I respect deeply. I don't think Biden represents a kind of Democrat that's a particular set of views that is in opposition to Sanders, and that's why I think it's a disaster. Now, I'm not agreeing with the people who claim that the left, the Democrats are all just one thing, socialist. I don't think that's the case either. But from the perspective of would I be willing to vote for Biden as a lesser of two evils, that's why I would say no. I don't think there's anything positive there. I think not being Trump isn't enough, and not being Trump or Sanders isn't enough for me.
Let's talk a little bit. We'll turn to questions in a moment, but let's, as a last point before we turn to questions, so we've talked longer term about the destruction of the Republican Party, and particularly from McGovern, and there's a swing to the right, and you get Reagan, and then a disintegration of it. But as we talked about, Rand thought this is exactly what Reagan's going to do. What do you think Trump's impact is on the Republican Party? And I'll just preface it a little bit. In terms of, I think part of the tragedy in the country is that because we have a bankruptcy, I think in both parties, it's getting filled more and more by nihilism. Mm-hmm. And that, so part of another aspect that I found depressing of the Hillary-Trump election is I thought the only chance Hillary has is if they run Trump against her. And the only chance that Trump has is if he's running against Hillary. Like if he ran against Obama would have destroyed him, I think. Yep. And so these are the two candidates that emerge from each party. They're so bad, and they can only win because the other party's so bad. And that's part of the dynamic of the parties now. This is who they're pushing for. And if you remember Trump, there was a lot of opposition in the Republicans against him until he got the nomination. And then it's, I guess we have to support this. And
I think it's worse than that, because there was some opposition to Trump even after he got elected, and there were some senators who for a while stood up against him and thought the particular, and that is gone. That is, the senators are now lockstep behind him. The ones who opposed him really have retired. The same in the House of Representatives. The so-called Freedom Caucus of the House, which used to be decent in terms of economic policy, is now 100% lockstep behind Trump. I mean, I think the impact that Trump has had on the Republican Party is profound. I think the party is it's stunning how within 4 years it has changed. But more than that, I think Trump has had a profound impact on the intellectuals of the right. And maybe I should say something about what I mean by right left, because I still use the terms, but differently than the way Ayn Rand used them. I still use them as differentiating two types of collectivists. Collectivists that are dominated by socialism, and collectivists that are more fascist. Now, fascism is so that two distinct forms of collectivism in politics. I think collectivism of the left and collectivism of the right, and I think of individualism as being completely distinct from them, and the better people somewhere closer to us, away from both left and right. But it's hard to visualize that. But left and right, that's how people think, and it differentiates these groups. But the intellectuals of the right. So up until about 2 years ago, there was no such thing as a nationalist conservative movement. They are now think tanks that are dedicated to, conservatives' ways in which they can use the state to impose their moral agenda on the populace. I mean, think tanks that are dedicated to this. There is a legal scholar, a major legal scholar within the conservative movement that rejects originalism and textualism and believes that that all judges should interpret the Constitution based on the principle of the common good. And he is of the right, not of the left. And he's celebrated on the right. I don't think that would have necessarily happened without Trump. So I think there's been a complete shift in the way people on the right think towards more nationalism, towards actually more taking religion even more seriously, as the Catholics, and particularly among the Catholics, more intellectually, and towards more things like industrial policy. You see it. I mean, the character that really shows this is Tucker Carlson, who used to be supposedly a libertarian. He used to wear the Rothbardian bow tie and everything, and has shifted over time to where when Elizabeth Warren came out with the economic plan, Tucker Carlson said, yeah, it's kind of a Trump economic plan. There's very little difference between Elizabeth Warren's economic plan and Trump's. And I actually endorse this. This is pretty good. I hate her on other things, but on this, I agree with her. And that shift is that dramatic shift has happened within the Republican Party in 4 years, I find astounding. And it shows the depth of the damage that Trump has done to the Republican Party, has done to the cause of freedom. And I think that is one reason that I do think one could go back and say, I wish Hillary had won in some, as much as I hate Hillary and despise Hillary and disagree with Hillary and everything, I don't think the Republican Party would have been devastated and restructured and reimagined the way it has been.
And it's one of these missed opportunities that Ayn Rand herself talked about at various, she thought Wendell Willkie had a real opportunity to oppose the New Deal and then compromise. And it happened with the 52 election or the nomination and with Goldwater, as we've seen. And here, this was my one hope that night when Trump won, was that the Republicans would wake up and what the F just happened, and then regroup. And I was very I thought George Will was excellent in this unrelenting criticism. He has the best descriptions of Trump. I thought this would really make a move, and there's nothing. At least I don't.
Well, and George Will is being marginalized.
What's that?
George Will is being completely marginalized within the so-called conservative movement, and all the never Trumpers are completely irrelevant right now. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly right. There was an opportunity there for them to assert themselves and to steer whatever because Trump is an empty shell, is a complete pragmatist. They could have maybe steered him in a better direction, but no, most of them got captured by Trump.
And that's a feature of tribalism. I think this belonging to a group. And if you see the hypocrisy with Mitch McConnell on, you know, the flip-flopping on with regard to it, I mean, hypocrisy is never just a thing in itself. It's based on something deeper. And what it's based on here is, well, this is my group.
Yep. And that's
their group choosing the supreme.
The rise of tribalism and its connection to all of this, but yeah.
Okay, good. We're at the actually a little past the 90 minutes. So let's turn to some questions. And if you're watching us live, there's 3 ways you can, or no, 4, I guess, ways you can ask questions. So in Zoom, you can use the Q&A module, and some people have. You can use the chat, and a lot of people are using that as well. On YouTube, we have the chat, and there's the super chat as well. And Corey, thank you for the donation. That's really appreciated. And I guess you're streaming it on your channel you're on, right? So
I've got a quick super chat question here that's relevant to what we just talked about.
And then I have one from Zoom as well, relevant to just the last one.
Yeah, if there is nihilism of the left and right, what is the source of each respective form of nihilism? Does nihilism and authoritarianism go hand in hand? So I think we talked about the fact that the nihilism of the right, the source of religion, right, primarily. And the nihilism of the left, is it the failure of socialism? Is it the inevitable kind of collapse of any kind of Marxist attempt to manifest in reality? Or is socialism in and of itself already nihilism?
Well, I think they lost their pretense that they could actually achieve the flourishing and production of capitalism, and yet it can be properly distributed. That was destroyed. And that's why environmentalism is the perfect, it was the savior of the left, because you can now be Eugene Lawson, where it's good that people don't have as many cars as they did. We don't want the people in the third world, in Asia, particularly, let's say, or sub-Saharan Africa. We don't want them to become flourishing capitalistic cultures like, you know, China managed to do in some of its regions. That's a disaster. And I think it's nihilism, and but yeah, it's failed. I mean, now Ayn Rand attributed to I think the end of World War II, right? By then she thought, you know, even the pretense of collectivism was gone. I mean, the intellectuals continued to present those views, but
and I forget exactly what the question, how it was phrased, but there's a difference between thinking of the expression of nihilism and its deepest roots. If you want to get its deepest roots, Ayn Rand has an essay, The Age of Envy, where she talks about how a mentality comes about, that its orientation to values is not, this is something to go after, to seek, but this is something to destroy, to wipe out. And how that can develop versus what movements and so on give it expression. And I think what Robert, you were bringing up about the new left, they're faced with a contradiction. The old left was like, we've got this program that's supposedly scientific, rational, leads to progress. And in practice, what it leads to is bloodshed everywhere. And then do you rethink your views, or do you pick up other views that enable you to go after the same goal? In her view, the new leftist sheds all this pretense that it's rational, it's scientific. And I mean, in the environmentalism, it's, you're better off to go without things. You're better, poverty's good. And it's the embrace of the destruction that's really motivated him. And I think when she talks about religion, and particularly as it comes into the Republican Party with Reagan and so on, she thinks of it as it's a wiping out. I mean, one of the ones she talks about is creationism, and the elevating of arbitrary emotional pronouncements. God created the thing in 7 days, as this is the equivalent of science, and we want this taught along science. And that all that is the destruction and tearing down of science. Nobody can actually think that there's any argument, any evidence here, but we want this view on par. And I think she thought of that as, this is a wiping out. And so it's in a lot of movements, you can have people who, what actually attracts them to it is the wiping out of things. And she talks about it. It's like, it's not the moral majority didn't bring creationism. It was, this has been a kind of view in American history. You see it with the Scopes trial, but they're in the backwaters. They don't have any significance. What gives them significance is a complete bankruptcy and then inviting them in to the party. And then it's you're inviting in the nihilist, but they can exist in all kinds of movements. And they do, I think. And that age of envy is very interesting from the deeper perspective of this. Okay, here's something from Zoom. It related to one of the last issues. I think this question relates to one of the last issues we were talking about. And it also relates to her view of Reagan. And it's not, the question isn't put exactly like this, but I'll put it like this. It's about thinking about the short term and the long term. So that if you're thinking of this election, Biden, Trump, Democrats, Republicans won't, in the short term, won't a Biden presidency. So here's the question. Give us Obamacare, then universal health care. We'll get steps towards the Green New Deal. Meanwhile, the question is, Trump has done much good. But even if you thought, well, he hasn't done good, is it going to, in the short term, is it going to be as bad? So that's the question in terms of thinking about how to vote. I would put the wider thing is thinking about the short term and the long term.
I mean, I think, so first, I think a lot of people in trying to defend voting for Trump present a Biden victory as kind of an end of the world. It's an end of America. We adopt socialism instantaneously, right? And in the short run, it is such a disaster that there's no recovering in the long run. And I just think that's false. I think while a lot of bad will be done if Biden gets elected, there's no question of that. I think a lot of bad is being done by Trump. And if he wins a second term, I think that the bad to the country long term is dramatic and significant, and I'm not sure we can recover from it. On the other hand, if Biden wins, I think, yeah, he'll pass some bad stuff, particularly if he has the Senate. I've urged people, if they're going to vote for Biden, to vote Republican in the Senate, to try to have, if we have 51 senators in the Senate, at least you won't get the worst of or at least the Green New Deal will be a little smaller. It won't be quite as big.
You've urged people on your show.
I've urged people on my show, not as part of the Iron Man Institute, because I don't urge anybody to do anything. But anything with regard to voting. But it's the case that the American system of government is built so that things happen slowly. If you think about Obama, he had 2 years where he was president, he had the Senate and he had the House. And he barely got Obamacare through. I mean, it was a kind of, he had to do some kind of legislative trick to get it through at the last minute. It's very difficult to do dramatic changes, even if you control all the different branches of government. The senators on the Democratic side are not all on AOC's side. There are many senators who come from red states who, if they vote on the most nutty of the left's agenda, will lose their senatorial races in the future. So there were a lot of it. It's wrong to think of these kind of things as, we'll take the worst of the Democrats and assume that no matter what Democrat gets elected, those things will be implemented. And the fact is that through legislation, it is very difficult to change the country quickly. Long term, it would be terrible if Biden won, and then Kamala or AOC or whoever won after that, and you have a string moving towards socialism. That would be terrible. The only hope I think we have politically to buy us time is if Biden wins, then the Republicans take House and Senate in 2 years, and then maybe they win the presidency in 4, and maybe it's a better Republican than Trump who wins then. There's no good outcome where Biden, like win in the long run, and there's no good outcome if Republicans win it all out in the long run, unfortunately, in the world in which we live.
I want to reject the idea that Trump has done good things.
Well, so we had another question like that. So just to acknowledge, so someone asked exactly, do you think Trump has done anything of benefit economically, internationally, trade agreements, tariffs? So
I don't think so. And I regard Trump's actions, if you understand the objectivist view of the arbitrary, that an arbitrary statement is neither true nor false. It has no basis in reality. I think the same way, and not merely as an analogy, I think, of Trump's so-called the things he's done that are good. That is just as an arbitrary statement might be in the, uttered by someone else who has a cognitive, right to make certain utterances. It could be true or perhaps false. The good things he does, they're neither good or bad. They're beyond evaluation because they're coming from someone who is utterly, in my view, divorced from reality. His statements are. So the only evaluation I can make is that they're embarrassing, that they're bad for us. These could be the same actions if they had been presented by even someone who was just president. You could cheer them. I mean, moving the Israeli capital to Jerusalem, pulling us out of the Paris Climate Accord, going to California and saying, if you're someone who actually read books and had the science behind you, saying that these fires were more the result of forestry management than they were of climate change. Instead, what are they? They're the actions or utterances of the guy who loves Kim Jong-un or whatever his name, right? And a zillion other bizarre, arbitrary statements. So it's all just, it's embarrassing. And that happened when he pulled out of Paris Accord. I thought people are going to take this as a ridiculous joke. Now, if he wins the election in 4 years, every single thing he does is good and has good consequences, I'll revisit my opinion. But right now, I don't think he can do good. And by contrast, take someone like Reagan, who said some pretty negative things about him. When he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, I cheered. When he referred to the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the world, yes, because as bad as he was not a I don't know, what can I say that's polite about a president, a whim-worshipping psychopath? I'll make it modern. That's how I view him. I think he's just, I think the guy who Ghost wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, said that he was a sociopath who never read who never read a book or something. I believe it.
He's a complete irrationalist, and so anything good he does is associated with the irrationalism, and therefore it is completely empty and becomes meaningless. And indeed, any other president would immediately reverse them, and they're all easily reversible. Maybe the embassy to Jerusalem will not be, but almost everything else is easily and will be reversed. And serious people can't take what he say seriously. So, yeah, I agree with that completely, but. The fact is that even if you draw, do lists, people love doing these lists, check how many good things he did and how many bad things he did. The bad is in more significant areas. It's more substantial. It's more significant. The good stuff are relatively small things that are fleeting and that don't have much substance behind them. I'll just give you one example, but this is an example that is true of every Republican, but it's something people get caught up with, and I hear this all the time. He cut taxes. I hear this all the time. And of course, every Republican except George Bush Sr. cut taxes, right? But if you cut taxes and don't cut spending, you're actually increasing taxes. It's meaningless. The fact that you cut taxes is actually meaningless to the actual standard of living and quality of life of Americans. It's actually harmful to them if you continue to spend like a maniac. So you can view it as a positive, but not if you dig a little deeper. Immediately, it's a negative when you associate it with the broader context.
So let me see if you agree with this sort of summary go back to the way Ayn Rand thought about Reagan, that if you tie the advocacy of and again, supposedly, like how much he was actually advocating capitalism, freedom, individual rights, but he certainly was held as somehow being on the side of that. If you tie that to the religion, then you're discrediting the position, because you're suggesting that, oh, well, if you're going to be scientific and rational, you would reach a different conclusion. You have to divorce yourself and have faith and base it in religion. It's a step even lower to say, I don't need any basis for anything I say or do. I don't even need the semblance of an argument appeal to the Bible or to tradition or to Christianity. And if you're going to discredit a position, you can't get any lower than, yeah, I've got no arguments, I've got no evidence. It's just, I mean, Robert, you put it as well, it's whim. So it's just, if you say, like, this is what backs my position, then anyone who thinks of themselves as semi-reasonable, semi-scientific thinks, okay, well, so if that's what your base, you have to do something different than this, because this is just whim.
Yeah, I mean, everything he does is because of that. It's full of contradictions, and there's no way for anybody innocent to get anything positive out of it. So I love the brutal dictator of North Korea and Bibi Netanyahu and Israel, right? What do you do with that? There's nothing. Is Bibi as bad as the guy in North Korea? Is the guy in North Korea as good as Bibi? And I'm a big Bibi critic, but in comparison, he's a saint as compared to the guy in North Korea. Or I believe in deregulating massive industries, but I'm going to call up CEOs and tell them they can't fire their employees, and I'm gonna denounce them when they make business decisions. Okay, what are you for? Freedom or anti-freedom? For controls or anti-controls? It's completely unintelligible. And the idea that the better things, moving the embassy, deregulating, is associated with that, with all the negative things, destroys the goodness in the good actions that he's done.
Okay, let's shift a little bit. Here's a question going back to the abortion issue and related to the nihilism. So the question is, I'll put it as a question, it's sort of a statement, but don't the people against abortion actually believe that the fetus is a baby, and therefore they think the future baby gains a lot? So this is on the issue of, is it nihilism, or is it, no, they're actually thinking there's something there that gains?
So I think you could make that argument about abortion in the third trimester, and I think the argument about abortion in the third trimester is wrong. The anti-abortion is wrong, but it's, at least there's a semblance of truth. But in the first trimester, it is, as I think Kleiner Peikoff described it, as a clump of cells, right? It's a potential under very strict circumstances to become a human being, but it's just a potential. And you can't mistake this clump of cells for a human being. It's not a human being. So no, I don't think that they're trying to preserve, human beings, and it's a positive in that circumstances. And yet, most people who don't believe abortion should be legal in the third trimester also don't think they should be legal in the first trimester. And as a consequence, you have to paint them with that. You have to take them seriously on the first trimester issue. And yes, they're anti the mother's life. They're anti-sex. They're anti-individual rights. They're anti-life.
And Ira has a portrait of what happens when religionists, if they have their view of abortion and birth control too, but I think she'd apply it in this case. It's not just, well, we have a baby here and some inconvenience over here. Isn't it the right of the baby? What would it do to the life of the person? Not just their sex life, but if they get pregnant, because birth control isn't. And she has this, I think, it's in Humane Vitae, right? Where she talks about, imagine what kind of life this person would
her
have.
Criticism of.
Criticism of it. Yeah, but she's compassionately saying, let's look at what really happens in reality. And you have a real human being here, a young person. Either they made a mistake, or something momentarily stupid, or the birth control didn't work, or whatever. Certainly, if you're following the Catholic Church and you use the rhythm method, that's the least effective, whatever. Versus a potential. It's not an actual entity yet with rights or values. Now, I think she would claim, and this actually came up in the nonfiction writing course in some discussion. I don't think it made it into the book, but you can imagine someone who's very young and they not very intelligent, haven't given a lot of thought. They might make a mistake of this kind and think that, yeah, you're destroying it. But no one who really gives it any thought could actually think it's the value of a baby. It's a real human life versus, I've heard it put, an inconvenience. And I think she thinks it's so crystal clear that, I've just killed 100,000 cells, right? Those are human cells. You could clone them, or some of them anyway. You can't take seriously, particularly these people who are against, the morning after pill and things of that sort. There's something going on here, and they're anti-sex, anti-value, the idea of a woman going out and having a career and choosing whether to have children and when and et cetera. That's what she's seeing, and that's nihilism. So I think it's possible that people make mistakes on this issue, particularly. And she even addresses that for any of you who've made the mistake of thinking that this is, et cetera, right? In I guess the age of mediocrity, is it?
Yeah, and more broadly, to say that the crusading advocacy for some position is nihilistic, to say everybody who seems to be on that side or thinks of them on that side, it's not. They're all nihilists. And this is your example of it. Like, a young person might be confused and hasn't thought it. That's different than someone who crusades against abortion and wants to make it illegal, and abortion's murder, and that's when you get to the nihilism, that you're making this a crusading issue in your life. Let's take a last. It might not be that easy to do quickly, but again, we've got a super chat question. So Navid, thank you for the contribution. It's about immigration. And wouldn't Rand think that Trump's view of immigration makes sense because it's one of the biggest collectivist blocks in the US? So so I guess the question is to restrict and significantly restrict immigration is a way to battle collectivism?
Funnily enough, I just read somebody sent me this survey of Latino voters, and I hope it's right because it actually shows that they don't like to be called Latino voters. They consider themselves individuals, and they have opinions as individuals, and they don't even want to be. They don't think they should be taken for granted as Democrats or this or that. This whole idea that it's a collectivistic bloc, that immigrants are, it's just not true. It's not true in any dimension. Let's assume it were true that Republicans were individualists and Democrats were collectivists, which is not true, right? I could argue whites are collectivists because they vote Republicans and Republicans are collectivists. So, it's that way of thinking is just wrong. But the fact is Latinos vote across the whole agenda. Immigrants vote across the whole political spectrum. In Texas, they vote significantly Republican. They used to vote significantly Republican in California until Republicans became dramatically anti-immigration and anti-Hispanic, and they shifted their vote to the Democrats. Yeah, if Republicans compete on stage on who can be more anti-Latin, who can be more anti-immigrants, then immigrants are not going to like Republicans. That is a reality. But you can be a critic of the existing immigration policies, which I am, and I think all of us are, but not think that the solution is a wall, or not think that the solution is limiting immigration. So there is a bias in the immigration policies today towards particular parts of the world. There shouldn't be a bias. There should be just immigrants. And it's not, and I think if we had more open immigration, if we had more ability to come in, particularly if we had open immigration focused on people who can find jobs, then there would be immigrants from all over the world with all kinds of ideas, and they would be coming in, and you couldn't easily define them as any kind of block. And then finally, the idea that the government should get into the business of figuring out what immigrants think and then restricting them based on what they think, what ideas they have, is one of the scariest ideas I can think of. You know, if Republicans say, we're not going to bring in immigrants because they vote Democratic, and then Democrats say, we're not going to bring in immigrants because they vote something else. Just imagine if that applies to immigrants, what then they could, now that they're in the business of ideas, what else they could now start discriminating against us based on. So no, I don't know what Ayn Rand's exact position would be on immigration today. And as you probably know, there's a wide array of points of view within objectivism about immigration, but I certainly don't think that would capture it.
And you're aware, I hope, or maybe not, that she was asked a question like this. And she said, she gave a reason, you know, someone had asked a question about immigration and taking jobs or something. And she started out by saying, and I'm not going to try to convey the anger in her voice, that you don't understand her conception, or she says to the speaker, I'm not talking to the one who asked the question here. She says, in effect, you don't understand my conception of egoism if you think, you know, you have the right to keep people from leaving the country or entering the country because it affects, you know, your ability to get a job, if that were even true. And then she adds, but aren't you dropping a huge personal context? You know, she would have died in Russia at a young age had it not been for her ability to immigrate. I'll add one historical point. Ayn Rand knew a lot about the nature of the CPUSA, the Communist Party of America, when she was working in Hollywood. She knew that it was packed with immigrants. There were, I mean, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Communist Party, there were a lot of European immigrants because, you know, they didn't like the, you know, whatever, and they came here. I don't think she once thought the solution was to keep those people out. And she was probably aware that there were German spies. She certainly had strong views against the incarceration of Japanese Americans, which was despicable. So I can't imagine, I'm not going to speak for her. I could imagine a certain context. If we were at war with Iraq, should we, you know, there might be certain kinds of immigrants that, I don't know. She never really discussed that. But she always saw this as an intellectual, an ideological, a philosophical war, a battle. And you're not going to win it by, you know, passing laws that keep certain people out. And if there is a really dangerous principle, because, you know, Blacks tend to vote left. Why don't we stop that? And you know, you could do that. Women vote. It's just, and I don't know. When do immigrants get a right to vote? At what point? I mean, they have to become citizens.
Yeah, illegal.
Yeah, they have to become citizens. So I think this is one of those issues to go back to the beginning, where I think if you feel strongly about this, you have to try to articulate in your mind. Then, you know, I disagree with Ayn Rand on this particular issue.
I want to say one other thing on this, bring it back to some of what we talked about before. I think this is another instance of the Republican Party being our party is too, we don't like immigrants. And that too, and has gone out the window now. It's the party of we're against immigrants. And what you said, there's no better way to drive people into groups of self-protection than to demonize them.
Yep.
If you demonize immigrants and then you complain, well, they're a block, and so they might be a block because there's strength in numbers when you're going after them and you're rapists and criminals and go home. And that the Republican in early 21st century was better on the issue of immigration. And it was, again, the Democrats are bad on this.
Oh, yeah.
I think there is a real element that the Democrats want immigrants because they think they vote Democrat, whether that's true or not. But they see people as collectives and groups. And the Republicans could have embraced No, we're more individual. We want immigrants from across the world if you're ready to work and so on. And it's, again, they failed in regard to that, to have a better position. And it's, no, we're anti-immigrants. And then now you have a choice, both sides on immigration are bad.
And Reagan was excellent on immigration. I mean, his last speech was on immigration, and it's a fantastic speech.
Yeah, it is.
It's stunning how good it is. And this is the thing. It's one thing for some people within the Republican Party and a certain wing of the Republican Party to be anti-immigration. But what Trump has done, as he has emptied the Republican Party from anybody who's pro-immigration. So all the pro-immigration voices are gone. They're silenced. And this is the sense in which I think he's transformed the Republican Party in ways that if I think he wins again, it will not be able to recover. And I think that would be, that is, that is a tragedy, not because I love the Republican Party, but because you need some opposition to the left. Even if it's weak opposition, you need something to buy time for the better elements in society to give the world a real alternative.
Okay, we're over time by 5 minutes, so I should bring this to an end. Thanks,
Sure,
everybody.
a million questions.
Yeah, we have a ton of questions. So thanks for all the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And thanks again for the contributions through Super Chat. We really appreciate that. I hope you found this interesting, at least, and I know we got at least to some of the questions, not all of them. But thanks for joining, and thanks, Robert, you're on, for all your contributions. This was really good. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, guys.